Hello. Thank you for joining me. My name is Nicole Shea. I am a proud member of the Personal MBA Coach team. Tonight, we're going to talk about considerations for a successful EMBA application or Executive MBA application. I'll call it EMBA for brevity's sake. So we'll talk about, whether or not the EMBA program is the right fit for you, what to think about when choosing a program, what to think about for admissions, and then what happens when you hit submit. So let me first start by telling you a little bit more about our services. Personal MBA Coach has been top ranked on Poets&Quants last year. In the US, we presented at the annual GMAT conference with all of the admissions directors from top schools. And overall, we have a 96% success rate. And last year, our clients got in with $6.5 million in scholarships. We are family operated and run by Scott and his sister, and I'll introduce the team in a moment. And all of our clients receive one-on-one support from either Scott or another senior former admissions director on the team like myself. We have clients to network with at all top schools, and we have a robust project management tool our clients use to seamlessly move through the application process with us. So love to tell you a little bit more about the team. Scott is our founder. He went to MIT undergrad, where he studied business and economics at Sloan. He began his career after undergrad at Deloitte. And then after Deloitte, he went to Wharton for his MBA, and he started Personal MBA Coach while he was there. I joined the team recently after spending 6 years on the admissions committee at Columbia Business School. While I was there, I was invited to participate in many events and panels with colleagues from other M7 schools for organizations including Forte and the MBA Tour. We also have MJ Shores, who is a former Wharton and UCLA MBA admissions director, and Scott's sister Erin, who went to Yale for her MBA, worked at Bain, and is a former Forte scholar. So let's quickly talk about what we do, and then we'll get into the presentation. So let's say you're early on and you're not sure what you want to do. We have early planning packages for those who are planning to apply in a future year, but aren't quite ready yet. We help people think through how to perfect their stories between now and when they're ready to apply. Our comprehensive packages help clients throughout all aspects of the application process and include story development, essay planning, interview prep, among other support. We also have GMAT, GRE, and executive assessment tutoring. We have in-house software that guides you through tutoring sessions with modules, sample questions, thousands of answers, full-length exams, and we provide a pretty customized approach to tutoring. I won't go into all the details today, but our clients do really well in raising their scores, and we guarantee happiness with all of our services, tutoring included. And we have a team of former M7 interviewers to help you prepare for your interviews and clients to network with at all top schools. We do this for all MBA programs as well as specialized masters and other graduate programs. So we're going to talk about the factors to consider when deciding if an EMBA is the right fit. I will say if you have questions as we're going along, feel free to type them in the chat. I'll either address them, as we go along. There will also be time for Q&A at the end. So the first is years of work experience. I would say, if you're trying to decide between an MBA and an EMBA, the greatest difference between the two is the years of work experience that you have. EMBA programs across top schools have large ranges in terms of their average years of work experience. So for example, CBS or Columbia Business School has an average of 9 years of work experience for its executive MBA program. So it's probably the school with the lowest years, whereas MIT is 17 years. As part of our services, we can help you understand which schools will help you reach your goal when you're ready. There's no wrong choice. Columbia has folks with 25 years of work experience alongside folks with 5 years of work experience. It really depends on what these people's goals, their previous trajectory in terms of professional experience is. But it's important to understand that the average number of years is typically 9+. And so if you fall around there, that's a really good indication that this is the right population, the right student body for you to join as a classmate or peer. The second consideration is the management of people or projects. So, when I was at Columbia, oversaw recruitment for Executive MBA program, and people would often panic, well, I'm not an executive, and so why would I do an Executive MBA? And really, and this will also come back to executive aspirations on this list, is that what committees are looking for is really the management of people and or projects. There are a lot of very reputable companies and people with really big titles that work in flat organizations. And so in that case, they're not going to manage people, but they do have tremendous responsibilities managing projects and things like that. And so that is kind of one of the questions that you should answer yes to while thinking about whether or not it's a good fit. And, if this isn't you, depending on your years of work experience, a full-time program might be better. And then you'll want to consider your post-MBA goals. What are you hoping to get out of the program? If you're looking to make a large career pivot, so a function and industry pivot, you might consider a full-time executive program like Sloan Fellows, Stanford's MSX program. LBS also has a Sloan Fellows program. That'll give you that 1 year to really focus on career and school without having to work full-time. If you're looking to sharpen your current skills and to make yourself more valuable to your current or a similar organization, then nearly every Executive MBA program is going to be a good fit. And then I mentioned executive aspirations earlier on. So schools are going to know, what are you hoping to do long-term? Do you have aspirations of being a business leader? Top schools are looking for people who want to use the EMBA to be a leader within their industry rather than using it to just check a box. Schools want accomplished, engaged alums. So if you're not looking for an executive or prominent leadership role long-term, a specialized master's might make more sense. So maybe a master's in marketing or finance or real estate. And then finally, work-school balance. So you might wonder what this means. Nearly all top EMBA programs, with the exception of the 1 year full-time exec programs that I just mentioned, will require you to be employed full-time for the duration of the program. So that means you are working your full-time job while completing an Executive MBA in typically 20 to 24 months. That's almost the same cadence as a full-time MBA for students who don't have full-time jobs. So is this something that you think that you'll be able to manage? Is it something that you can make a priority? And for most programs, you're going to have to know whether your manager will allow you to take time off that's needed to complete the program requirements. And whether or not your employer is willing to put in writing that they give you the green light to pursue the EMBA while continuing your current position full time. That is what you call time sponsorship. Not all programs require time sponsorship in writing, but many will. So if you'd like to pursue a program but can't obtain confirmation from your employer, you'll want to consider programs that don't require it. So for example, Columbia's EMBA Saturday program doesn't require your manager to sign off because, they hope that the Saturdays are yours and you can make a decision on that. And then next, let's talk about evaluating the programs. So there are a lot of considerations. It's not as easy as full-time where, you're not tied to a job, so you can kind of go to any city. That most of them start in August, most of them are 20 months. For EMBA, there's a lot more variability and a lot more considerations. that need to be made. So first is location. Most top programs will be nearly 100% in person for all class meetings. Despite COVID, there were times when these programs were 100% online because of COVID. But given what we know, these programs aren't considering maintaining any kind of hybrid or online aspect when it's safe to be on campus. So think about the cities that would be feasible for you to travel to given your current location. Some programs have satellite campuses where you can complete your EMBA, such as Wharton's San Francisco campus. Booth has a Chicago, a London, and Hong Kong locations. So keep those in mind. But, I think part of the thought process is, maybe you're in DC. You're thinking M7 business schools, you're willing to travel to Philly and New York City, but Boston or Chicago might be too far given your situation. This helps to narrow down your list. And then you'll want to dive further into the details of the Philadelphia and New York City programs. And then you'll want to familiarize yourself with the formats of the programs in the cities that make sense for you. I would say that truly no EMBA program has the same format. So it's really an important consideration at what the cadence is at which the classes can occur. So there are weekends. I would say most programs, most schools will have some sort of weekend option. For Columbia, they had every Saturday for 24 months, every other Friday, Saturday for 20 months. Booth has a weekend option. Wharton's program is typically around the weekends. Usually that means a Friday, Saturday, and or Sunday. So familiarize yourself with the formats. There's also some schools have block week formats. So that means that you're taking, one week of classes per month for a set number of months. That means you have to have a manager sign off for 1 week off of work for 1 month or 1 week per month because you're going to be in classes all day. So Chicago Booth and Columbia London Business School Partnership both offer EMBA programs that can be completed by attending a class for an entire week about once a month for typically 20 to 22 months. For Booth, these block week programs are their London and their Hong Kong programs. And like I mentioned, Columbia's is in partnership with London Business School. It's typically not easy to convince management to approve these programs, so they are less popular. But what that typically means is that you have these small, close-knit class sizes that get to know each other incredibly well. They're typically incredibly strong students because they've earned that trust of their employer to leave for a week. And I will say with weekend programs, you have to keep in mind that if it's something like a Friday, Saturday program or a weekend program, these programs typically will also include a block week, maybe at the beginning of every semester or at the beginning of a few semesters. So there are typically larger commitments than just those weekends that you would have to kind of run by your manager before committing to a program. Typically, these programs will also have an international component that is 1 week long during the program that you will have to complete. And then, like we talked about before, there are full-time programs. So there are the 1 year full-time executive programs where you forgo a year of work, spend time on campus, and then they're not necessarily formally called EMBA programs. Like we talked about, you have the Sloan Fellows programs at LBS, Stanford, and MIT. You also have USC's iBear program, I believe it is, and there are a couple of others. They tend to provide the same academic experience and skill sets. They're just quicker and more immersive. And then company sponsorship. So this is something that you would want to consider your company may be willing to sponsor you for one of these. And so kind of having the conversation of if they are willing to sponsor, what does that look like? Is it, this amount per year? And in that case, do you want to see which programs span across the most calendar years? Are they willing to sponsor one that is mostly weekends versus a block week program? So having that conversation, understand how they're willing to help fund the program, can help you to decide which format makes sense for you. And then program matriculation timing. So oftentimes the program start doesn't make a huge difference to an application. But you'll want to be aware of your target program start times, because the programs that start in January, like Stern, give you the option of, because the programs like Stern give you an option of January or August or May, such as Wharton, they have earlier application deadlines. So, if you're thinking of Stern in January, if you're thinking of Wharton, which only starts once a year in May, you want to make sure that you're aware that those deadlines are going to be earlier than some of the other programs that start in August, which is what applicants are typically used to. They're typically used to a program starting in August, the start of the school year, and that's not always the case. So being aware of this and how that might change your application deadlines. And then the flexibility of the coursework, I think, is really important to consider. So most programs are never going to ask you to declare a specific major or track, but they might. And if they do, you'll want to understand kind of the flexibility of your elective courses. But even if they don't ask you to declare something, you'll want to understand the breadth of a school's elective offerings, and if they have the courses you're looking for to gain the expertise that you're seeking. So some schools will allow you to take electives kind of across the programs, whether it's full-time or EMBA, depending on your schedule. Some schools have the same electives for full-time and for EMBA, they're just done on different schedules, but taught by the same professors. And in some cases, the programs are completely separate. I think there are pros and cons to both of those situations. And so making sure that if you do select a school and you're really interested in product management or venture capital or, nonprofits and social enterprise, that you take a look at the electives that are offered and confirm that the school A has those electives, and B, that the EMBA program allows the flexibility for you to take them. So admissions, the process is, not dissimilar to applying to undergrad in some ways, and in some ways it's going to take a lot more kind of thought about your future. So the first is determining the appropriate round. If you know anything about full-time admissions, you know that there are typically 2 to 3 rounds, and schools will, and you have the best chance applying in round 1, and you're most competitive in round 1. What I will say about EMBA is that applying for round 1 isn't as imperative as it is with a traditional MBA. There's just kind of, these are busy people. They decide when they want to apply. It's not typically a year ahead when the applications open, and they, it just seems like human nature that they apply much closer to the deadlines. That being said, if you're slightly less competitive, the earlier the better. And then how do I know if I'm a competitive applicant? So I think this is a very fair question. I think there's so much variability in terms of the backgrounds, the years of work experience, the goals in an EMBA class than there is in a full-time class. And I think that's what makes it so great. But oftentimes it can be hard to understand if you're a competitive applicant. These schools love non-traditional backgrounds. I can think about a Columbia, in the EMBA program, there was a professional ballerina, There were Broadway producers of some pretty popular shows, a producer of a very popular skit television show, and a lot of other just like non-traditional educational backgrounds that brought a really nice perspective to the class. So if you're non-traditional, that doesn't mean that you're not a competitive applicant. And oftentimes these schools are really looking for that kind of diversity. So let me answer the question. There are two ways where you can kind of evaluate whether your profile is strong or not for a school. So the first is to take a look at the class profile. You can usually Google like Booth, EMBA, weekend, class profile. Do you see yourself in there? You know, do you fit kind of the average years of work experience or the range? You know, do you see your industry represented? And like I said, even if you don't see your industry represented, oftentimes maybe you see your function. There are a lot of different aspects of the profile that might align with what you have going on. So take a look at that. The other thing that I will say is that most of these schools, like I know Kellogg, I know Columbia, have a place on the website where you can upload your resume for a very high level review. And the admissions committees will send you back typically some kind of feedback. It's usually very high level, kind of red light, yellow light, green light. Green, we think your background is great and we would encourage you to apply. Yellow, you know, maybe you need a couple more years of work experience, or when you're applying, make sure that you address this gap or this question on your resume. And red could also be, you know, not yet, work experience isn't strong enough, or, you know, we have a lot more questions before we'd encourage you to go ahead and apply. So this resume review tool can be incredibly helpful to get a gut check before you go ahead and put the time and effort into an application. And then also an EMBA consideration is planning to take a standardized test. There are very few top tier executive MBA programs that don't require a standardized test or have a waiver. So keep that in mind. Some do, and if this is, you know, overwhelming to you, then you might consider that. I think NYU has some waiver if you meet the criteria. And so really keeping that in mind, understanding that if you don't or can't take a standardized test, that kind of even further helps you to narrow your options. But let's talk a little bit more about the standardized test, just because I think that this is something that a lot of executive MBA prospects are so far out of standardized tests. It becomes very intimidating and very daunting. So you will have the choice for these programs of taking the GMAT, the GRE, or the executive assessment. You might not have heard of the executive assessment. You may have. It's fairly new, and it was designed for executive programs in mind. I've heard it be described as a baby GMAT. So you could essentially prep for it in the same way you prep for a GMAT, except it doesn't have geometry and it doesn't have writing. The scoring is different. The way that the computer-based testing works is different. So familiarizing yourself with that, but it's supposed to be more approachable for folks who have more work experience, and the total score actually includes integrative reasoning, critical thinking skills. And so it usually is more approachable for those who have a bit more work experience. All of these tests, their scores are valid for 5 years. So if you already took one in the past 5 years, you may not need to take another one, and you may just want to use that. So a lot of times people will ask, you know, which test should I take? I would say, in my experience, the EA, the executive assessment, is really the most approachable. If you have some kind of business function, you've been doing it for, you know, 5+ years. However, keep in mind, some schools will let anyone use an executive assessment score. So for Columbia, anyone can apply with an executive assessment score. For Wharton, I believe you can only apply with an EA score. if you have over 10 years of work experience. So again, look into this. But for most people, the executive assessment is a really great option and should be more approachable, take a little bit less prep. If you have a structured business background and your only choices are GMAT or GRE, the GMAT is a really great test. And the other thing to be said about the GMAT is by preparing for the GMAT, it will help you kind of hit the ground running in some of those core classes you might be required to take by brushing up on those skills. The GRE, so if you're coming from a non-traditional background, more of a humanities background, the GRE tends to be a little bit more approachable. It's not a rule, but it tends to be a little bit more approachable given that it is for graduate programs across different disciplines, not just business. So definitely keep that in mind as you are exploring the tests. And then a question that I would get a lot at Columbia is like, what is a good score? Well, I'll first say that you should not be looking at the full-time test score averages for these programs to determine what is a competitive score for an executive MBA program. They are not the same. Executive MBA programs, the class profile may have averages. So definitely you can look to that to kind of understand what a competitive score might be. But I would say more often than not, executive MBA programs don't as readily publish their test score averages. And that's because the test score is more used to ensure that the committee has a contemporary indication of your academic abilities, and that they're confirming that you'll be able to handle the rigor of the academic coursework rather than having an incredibly high score, an incredibly strong pool of people. This is a smaller, more self-selecting pool of applicants. And so while it is competitive and you have to prove your academic abilities, you don't have to have these like insanely inflated scores that you see in the full-time programs for the same schools, because the applicant pool is just not as saturated. So, I hate throwing out numbers because every school is a little bit different. But for the sake of, giving some kind of number, I would say with the GMAT, trying to shoot for a 650 or above. Again, looking at the website, seeing what they say, talking to members of the admissions committees, listening to webinars for the schools that you're interested in. The GRE, I would probably say like a 154 or above in both verbal and quant domains. And the executive assessment, I'd say maybe 150, 152 or above. It's going to vary per program. The more competitive, the more prestigious the program, the higher the score you'll want to get, but don't let the test score be the reason that you don't apply. Talk to someone in the program, ask them about your score, and typically they'll be very frank with you and say, you know what, you're really going to need to retake that to be considered, or you know what, I have no concern about that test score, go ahead and submit. And then let's talk about some application tips. I see we have someone else joining. Feel free to ask questions during the presentation. We also are recording it and we'll post it to the website. So, you can go back and listen to what you missed. So on the topic of test prep, really start as early as possible. I would say begin by taking a practice test or two to get a baseline score before going ahead and singing for the real thing. Thinking about how you learn best and get help accordingly. So if you are really good at self-studying, you might buy the prep materials from the GMAT or the ETS website. You might go out and buy a Kaplan book. Or if you work in a group setting, you might sign up for a prep course, like a group prep course, maybe like Manhattan Prep. If you learn well one-on-one with customized tutoring, really focusing on your weaknesses, or companies like us, we have one-on-one tutoring with top tutors in the industry. And so you could reach out and talk to us about that. So there are a lot of different options. We find one-on-one tutoring works best because you can be more customized. You can say, I'm doing really well in this section, but I need time and attention on quantitative, and then you're not kind of at the same level as the peers in the group. And then another tool or tip, I guess, is reading short articles in top periodicals. So I've always been told, even for SAT prep, trying to read the Wall Street Journal every day, you kind of naturally pick up on vocabulary and it can help. So also something that's important is thinking about your letter of recommendation strategy. It's never too early to start thinking about who might write a letter. But you want to ask people that know you well. You want to ignore title or prestige. So you don't want to ask a CEO to write a letter if they don't know you and haven't worked closely with you. You typically want to ask your direct supervisor and someone else who's overseen your work either at your current or your former company. Most programs will require 1 to 3 letters of recommendation. I'd say the average is most often 2 letters. And if you want them to write about certain things that you think are kind of gaps, you might want to start taking on new projects now that they will be able to talk about in your letter. If you do have strong extracurriculars, maybe you have a leadership role in a volunteer organization, this might be an option. It's something that, if you're working with us, we could help choose like who would be the best recommenders. We would recommend asking them early. It doesn't mean that you have to give them 6 months notice, but you should certainly keep in mind holidays, breaks, and give them at least, 4 to 6 weeks to write a good letter. And then the use of additional influential and alumni informal notes can be used. So like if you know alums who want to write in on your behalf to the admissions office, typically schools are typically schools are welcoming to these. They'll attach them to your application and they'll be reviewed during admissions. And it can help, just like someone referring you to a job, having that referral of a member of the community can be helpful. So what makes a good letter of recommendation? So there are 4 things that we have identified. Specificity, so your recommender comparing you to others. Nicole is the top 5% of associates I've worked with in my 15-year career, things like that. Recency, these should be people that have seen what you've done in the workplace from, 2 years ago to present, usually not further. Honesty, so it shouldn't be a letter that is saying like, you are better than God, you don't do anything wrong ever, and you've never made a mistake. It's, it's better to see kind of where you have made mistakes and how you've improved, and detail is really useful too. So I wanted to talk about aligning important stakeholders and getting to know the schools. So we talked about this earlier. You want to discuss the prospect of pursuing an EMBA program as soon as possible with your stakeholders, and you want to ask them for their support. So this might be your manager. And if your manager agrees, you might want to start having this conversation with your teammates, with your direct reports, kind of setting and managing expectations. It'll allow you to have a better, more guilt-free, easier time when you are in class. People will tend to respect your boundaries more. But these aren't your only stakeholders. Chances are you might have a significant other or another family member or friends that rely on you for various number of things. And so you want to talk to them about the commitment that this will take and what it will look like and how others might need to help you in some ways to fulfill your commitments that may have to go by the wayside for the 2 years while you're in the program. So really getting that support, it will make the program be much more enjoyable and you'll get a lot more out of it. The other is seeking out students and alumni in your network. So if you work for an organization, talking to people that might have done an executive MBA or an MBA or an executive MBA at the schools that you're interested in. or former companies that you worked. So really kind of looking within your network, talking to people who have done the programs that you're interested in and asking them about their experiences. Understanding, what the pros and cons are will help you to make a more informed decision. And then finally, attending EMBA specific virtual events. So because of COVID, most of these schools aren't having in-person events, and they have numerous Executive MBA specific virtual events, either recorded or live. And so sign up for these, listen to them. There's often a lot of really good advice on how to approach the applications, the talking about what they're looking for in an applicant, and giving you kind of a clear representation of what they can offer, how they can help, what your experience will be like, and how you'll grow at that school. And then they're going to ask you those things in an essay. So it's really easy to then take that and kind of build your story out write a stronger essay, be more compelling in an interview. So essays, we help applicants with essays in a lot of different ways, line by line editing, and, commenting, track changes, things like that. We also help them with generating ideas. But there are some really kind of easy guiding principles to keep in mind if you're writing your essays and you aren't getting help from a consultant. So the first mistake that people will make is that they won't answer the question that is asked. Usually one of two things happens. Either you thought about your story, kind of what you want the committee to know, and you just try to plop that into the essay spot without giving consideration to what they're actually looking for. Or you've written an essay that you think is amazing for another school, and you try to take almost all of the aspects of that and paste it into an essay for another school when the questions are intrinsically somewhat different. So make sure that you're asking the questions. Schools spend a lot of time developing these questions because they're asking for the information their committee, their school needs to know to make an admissions decision. And if you don't ask or answer the question, it's going to be hard for them to consider you for interview or admission. Write authentically. Schools will know when you are trying to say what you think they want to hear rather than what you actually want to say. And ensure it fits with your personal story. So, making sure that your goals make sense based on your work experience, based on your passions, your interests that are going to come up elsewhere in the application. Try not to repeat yourself. If you have an essay writing about what you want to give to, what you want to contribute to a community, and then talking about how the community is going to help you, make sure you're using different resources, different classes, things like that. And be succinct. So I would joke at Columbia, try to use, succinct, to the point, shorter sentences. It's good practice for when you're in business and you have to communicate, and using approachable language. Using a lot of, lingo is not going to get you anywhere. It's oftentimes creates confusion, and try to pick unique topics where possible. So for questions where you're talking about yourself, what's important to you, being a little more personal, try to demonstrate what, or even work examples, try to demonstrate unique skill sets, unique passions. What makes you unique from, your prospective future peers. And then in terms of how to write, we, with our clients, will do brainstorming sessions on topics and key accomplishments that they should cover in the essays. And then we don't make our clients do this, but we would highly suggest that you write an outline that's roughly the same number of words as the essay itself, and then write a draft, and then do lots of rounds of editing. So we do unlimited editing with clients. I would say average between 5 and 10 rounds of editing. And then proofread. So asking someone else who isn't familiar with your materials to proofread for missing words, spelling errors, clarity will be really helpful. And then common essay errors. giving too much detail, not being succinct enough, having illogical goals. So maybe you've spent the last, 9 years in a marketing role and you're looking to make a pivot into venture capital with any prior experience or exposure. That's going to be really hard for an executive MBA admissions committee to think that you're going to be happy with kind of the prospects after 2 years, because that's not going to be a transition that you can make after 2 years. And then being too vague, so not having a clear goal in mind, or having no theme at all, and really just kind of being all over the place with your themes, with your resources, not really knowing what you want to do. This can make it hard for a committee to visualize you and your success at the school. So the interview. Nearly all programs are going to require you to do an interview, whether that's with an alum, a current student, or a member of the admissions committee. I've done hundreds of EMBA interviews, and so pretty familiar with the process. There can be a series of conversations. I always say it's a spectrum. Some are going to be a little more casual. They're going to really want to get to know you, your passions, your goals, your experiences, your motivations for an executive MBA. Others might be a little more behavioral. They might ask you, like, tell me about a time when something didn't go as planned. What was the result? Tell me about a recent failure. But oftentimes they want to know why an executive MBA, what are your short-term and long-term goals, why this school specifically. Oftentimes they'll ask about how you plan to balance work, school, and your personal life. They want to kind of hear about that. They want to see that you're dressed professionally, you're able to, articulate yourself well, your goals, things like that. And that you have not an executive presence, but a professional presence. And so that's kind of what they're looking for. And most likely before being admitted, you will have this process or this part of the process. One thing I will say, though, is that this is also an incredible opportunity for you to get to know the school, to ask someone who knows the school really well about maybe doubts or things that you weren't able to find online that you're curious about. So use it to your advantage too. And then qualities, like I said, like professional presence, presentation skills, or how you carry yourself, how you articulate, passion, clear goals. By clear goals in an interview, I mean the same goals that you wrote on your application. You should never go into an interview talking about different goals than what you put in an application. It is really hard for a committee to understand why you would change, and it kind of demonstrates some instability in your candidacy. And then program knowledge. So like we talked about, attend those webinars. You're going to be asked why that school. Be able to talk about classes, be able to talk about resources or experiential opportunities, student clubs, aspects of the EMBA experience that excite you and align with your personal and professional goals. And then a little bit, I just want to give a little bit of insight on the admissions process because I know it can be a black box. So who's on the admissions committee? This will really vary by school, school size. Committees can include recruiting staff, so AdCom team, career office staff, and outside readers. Large programs may have second-year students reading applications. I think typically for the Executive MBA program, this isn't the case, but it's possible. They will sometimes be interviewing, like I mentioned, and giving recommendations from the interview. And then a few programs will include academic program staff like faculty, deans, or other kind of administrative staff at the university or at the business school. Typically, it's going to be a more formal admissions committee, but they bring in these other people to make sure that they're confident that you're going to be happy and successful in the program. So what happens once the program or once the application is received? There's typically a quick review of completeness. You'll typically be notified of a missing item, say a missing recommendation or test score, before they start the review process. And then it will be then reviewed by a senior member of the team or one member of the committee. And then those who are competitive and meet kind of the requirement based on what they wrote will typically be invited to interview. And then we talked a little bit about this. How is the interview used? So they want to assess your personality, your interpersonal skills. Do you kind of have that community alignment that they're looking for? Kellogg really likes community, teamwork. Columbia, again, very collaborative, very kind of teamwork oriented. I would say most of the programs that is what it goes for, but like, are you someone who, discusses how you've supported a team? Have you demonstrated leadership skills? They want to know kind of what you're bringing into the classroom. Also, like I said, pressure testing your goals. Are these goals feasible? Are they the same as what you put in your essays? And if your goals are a little lofty, do you seem like the type of person that's coachable, that has the grit and has the rigor to really make things happen, to go out of your way and make things happen for you? And then evaluating interest in the program. So again, really important to know about the program, how it aligns with what you're hoping to achieve, both short-term and long-term post-MBA. And then to predict future performance. And so, you're not going to have on-campus recruiting the same as full-time applicants, but you are likely going to want to make some kind of pivot. You might want to explore different jobs if you're not sponsored or growing in your current company. And so, understanding if you're someone who will perform well in recruiting. And then also an opportunity to discuss information that's not in the application. So if there are gaps, if there are additional questions, maybe you live in Washington, D.C. and you're interested in doing Columbia's Every Saturday program, being able to articulate, like, from the committee side, what challenges other students have faced, and for you to say, this is the plan that I have in place, really answering any questions about gaps in your work experience, things like that. So it's just a time where you could be questioned about aspects of your application or be allowed to elaborate on your story, which might make you a more compelling applicant. So what happens after a good interview? Your application will go to another member of the team to get another review with that interview feedback in mind. And then it will typically go to an admissions director, admissions dean, and then be presented to an entire committee where a final decision will be rendered. Sometimes it's, by voting, typically by discussion, but they will render a final decision at that point. What happens after a negative interview? It will oftentimes lead to either a wait list so that we can learn more, or a rejection. In some cases, an interview can be considered an outlier and overlooked. It really depends on what the flags were. If you weren't super articulate on some points, but you were on others, it might just be that you needed a little practice and it could be revisited. If you showed up, super late and unprepared, that would probably be a reason to reject someone. So if you didn't feel great about your interview, it doesn't mean you're not going to be admitted, but typically negative interviews can kind of lead to either waitlist or rejection. Decisions are either released on a rolling basis or on a specified date. And so the school's website will tell you how they are released for each round. If you are denied, you'll have to wait until the following year to reapply, or apply for a different format if the school offers different formats. Some schools will offer feedback at the end of the year, but not during the application period. Some do not offer feedback at all and will refuse to discuss the decision. It's really going to depend on the school. If they have a policy, respect the policy. If they don't have a written policy, it never hurts to ask, but you should respect them if they say that, if they go on to say that they don't give feedback. So last year, our clients not only were admitted to top schools, but they got a lot of scholarship dollars, over $6.5 million in scholarships last year. These are some of the schools that our clients go to for both the Executive MBA and the full-time MBA. And then before I talk about how Personal MBA Coach can help, if you do have questions, feel free to type them in the chat. We can address them live. My email is also here, as well as Scott's, so you can always reach out at any time to chat with us or to get signed up for a free consultation to talk a little bit more about our services and your background. But we offer tutoring, brainstorming, personal story development, resume editing. The resume is a really important part. We didn't talk about it today, but it's different than a professional resume, and we help to convert it to an MBA resume. For essays, there's unlimited essay editing, guidance on content, line-by-line track changes and comments. We also help with letters of recommendation, so who to ask, key points that they should cover. If they give you a copy of their letter, we will review it. And then mock interviews with former M7 alumni or AdCom interviewers. So, former interviewers from nearly every school to help you prep, to know what to expect for that specific interview. You would be surprised at, how different interviews can be across schools and what they're looking for. And then if you want a more detailed information about top EMBA programs, you can download our EMBA program guide from the website. It's really useful. It talks about the different formats for each school, the duration of the programs, gives a little bit more insight into helping you narrow down your selections. So if you're interested in learning more about how we can help, you can schedule a free consultation. Again, my email or Scott's email, you can also schedule through our website. We'll ask you for information like your test score status, your undergrad GPA, ask to send a resume, maybe some of the schools you're thinking of, and we'll typically hop on the phone, talk about, whether those schools are feasible, considerations for whether or not you're a good candidate, and how we can help. So I see a question, are scholarships offered for EMBA programs? It's a great question. So not as readily as for full-time programs. Some schools give out more money than others. Because you're working full-time, a lot of schools try to allocate most of their scholarship dollars to the students that are foregoing income for 2 years. But I will say that in my experience, Columbia doesn't have a ton of EMBA fellowship money. So if it's really important to you, connecting with their financial aid office. I know they have an incredible financial aid office that helps to think about creative and smart ways to approach payment. But, in my experience, Cornell, Booth, Kellogg, all have given out fellowship dollars to competitive applicants. I think Wharton's a little bit tougher to get money from as well when it comes to executive MBAs. So that's my experience. If you are really interested in a program and it's a big consideration for you, I'd also just encourage you to reach out directly to their admissions office and ask. With EMBA, admissions officers tend to be a little bit more straightforward and forthcoming about information because it is kind of a different process than full-time. Great. Any other questions? Let me go back to this slide in case it is helpful. Well, I really appreciate your being here tonight, hearing about this. I hope that it was helpful. We covered a lot of ground. Like I said, it will be recorded, so we will post it on our website. If you missed anything or you want to kind of listen through some of the aspects, or keep in touch with us. You can always reach out to me. I'm happy to help navigate the process. I'd love to work together to work on your applications. You know, did this for 6 years at Columbia. The EMBA program, really near and dear to my heart. And so certainly something that I think Personal MBA Coach could be really helpful with. Have a great evening, morning, afternoon, depending on where you are, and hope to stay in touch.